everyone, I am Ember. Welcome, or welcome back. On this channel, we like to examine cults, conspiracies, and questionable science. And today, we may just have all three in one. I found a video from PragerU that claims to be about science and God. I guess the idea is to determine whether they're compatible or incompatible or what have you. But I don't see how that's going to work. So it should be interesting to explore. Now, in preface, the video is titled 5-part series, but there's only one video. So is it broken into parts? I don't know. We'll see as we go. If it is, that'll be awful handy if we end up doing a part 1 and a part 2 out of this thing. But we'll see as we go. Now, I do like to keep my preambles short. I like to get right into things. But before we begin, I have to ask, if you're new here, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button because it helps a new channel like this grow a lot, and I very much appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's hit it.
Can you believe in God and science at the same time? So-called new atheists like Richard Dawkins and scientific materialists like Neil deGrasse Tyson certainly don't think so. To them, religion gets in the way of science. In their view, more science leads to less God.
Well, the reason I stopped it here is because that whole more science, less God thing, that's not on the science side. That happens because of the God of the gaps fallacy. That happens because whenever there's something science hasn't explained yet, somebody inevitably tries to cram God into that little nook or cranny. What caused the Big Bang? God did it. So God gets shoved in there. And then as we explain more things, as science fills in those cracks, God gets kicked out of them. And so it seems like the more science we have, the less room there is left for God. That's not science's fault. That's people making bad arguments' fault.
This is not a new position. It was first expressed over 100 years ago by English physician John Draper in a book titled History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Draper, who was deeply influenced by Darwin's then new theory of evolution, regarded organized religion as a direct and existential threat to the advancement of science.
Well, he's not wrong. I mean, the Dark Ages come to mind, over 1,000 years, where human advancement was cut off because the church would not allow anything that might make the Bible look less than true. And we, as recently as the introduction of the printing press, the beginning of the scientific revolution, they were burning scientists at the stake for trying to reveal facts, scientific advancement that went against what the Bible says. So whenever religions have too much power, dead stop to science. No freaking question about it. How much of our scientific progress has happened in the last couple of 100 years since the church lost its grip on things? We went from steam engines to airplanes to spaceships. And now we have nuclear power and a space station. We have space-based telescopes that can see almost all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. All that in just a couple of 100 years. Where would we be if we hadn't lost that 1,000 years in the dark age of religion? Wow. Yeah, Draper was absolutely right.
As he put it, religion and science are absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. So are science and religion inevitably in conflict?
Not necessarily. There are ways that science and religion could coexist. Many modern scientists are religious people.
Have they always been? Well, not exactly. In fact, the giants who established modern science, astronomer Johannes Kepler, chemist Robert Boyle, physicist Sir Isaac Newton, and others, were deeply religious men.
Well, Kepler was religious in the way a person who is an atheist but afraid to be burned at the stake for being an atheist can be. Kepler, who was a student of Copernicus, remember, Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model. He was the one who wanted to challenge the church and say that the earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around. He made Kepler promise not to publish his work until Copernicus was dead. And he kept that promise. And then Kepler went on to refine the system. He had to be very, very careful to couch it in the terms of course, this isn't true, because the Bible is true, the church is true. But if we use this as an intellectual exercise, we create a fictional model of the earth going around the sun. Totally not true. But if we use it as a model, it makes our predictions so much easier. He was very careful because he did not want to die, which in turn kind of goes to show the danger of religion.
They didn't see any conflict between science and religion. On the contrary, they thought that by doing science, they were discovering God's design and revealing it to mankind. Indeed, it's no exaggeration to say that the Judeo-Christian religious tradition—
Point of order. There is no such thing as Judeo-Christian religious tradition. That is bullshit that Christians say to make it seem like the Christians and Jews believe basically the same thing. It's total nonsense. I'm not going to get into the deep details of it because that's not what this video is about. I just need to point out that is bullshit.
led directly to modern science.
No, absolutely not.
Up this claim, Cambridge University historian of science, Joseph Needham, posed a famous why there, why then question. Why there in Europe? Why then in the 16th and 17th centuries?
Ooh, I know. Because Martin Luther's Reformation and the Protestantism caused schisms in the church, which broke the Catholic Church's stranglehold on everything. It was because the printing press allowed people to spread ideas, and gradually people started to learn more. And within a couple hundred years, people's minds were starting to conflict with the absolute truth of the gospel. And with the schisms in the church, that opened cracks in society where people could start to stand up and say, this thing people say, that's not true. And I can prove it.
Why didn't modern science start somewhere else before then?
Ooh, I know this one too. Because the church killed them.
After all, the Egyptians erected pyramids. The Chinese invented the compass, block printing, and gunpowder. Romans built marvelous roads and aqueducts. The Greeks had great philosophers. Yet none of these cultures developed the systematic methods for investigating nature that arose in Western Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Well, actually, all of them did individually, but that's also outside the scope of this video. The Greeks did develop the scientific method. In fact, we still identify our various schools of science with PhDs, Doctor of Philosophy. It was the ancient philosophers. Aristotle himself established the first 6 schools of philosophical thought. All of this comes from the ancients. Europe lost all of that when the empire converted to Christianity and then fell apart, leaving just the church in charge of everything. That is literally the Dark Age, and that is literally why when the Ottoman Empire reintroduced Greek historical documents to Europe, it triggered the Renaissance. That's literally what the Renaissance was, relearning what had been known and had long been lost because of the church.
This realization led Needham and other historians of science, such as Ian Barber and Herbert Butterfield, to look for some other X factor to explain why the scientific revolution occurred where and when it did. Here's the conclusion they reached. Only the Judeo-Christian West had the necessary intellectual presuppositions to enable the rise of science.
That sounds vaguely racist-ish. The erasure of European racism notwithstanding, saying that the magical Judeo-Christian values gave Europeans some kind of totally not racist advantage over literally everyone else on Earth does nothing to explain why then. Ostensibly, they've had those magical values for the entire 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, and yet science somehow didn't crop up.
Those presuppositions. We can identify three. All find their origin in the Judeo-Christian idea of a creator God who fashioned an ordered universe.
You want to talk presuppositions? Did you see the way he just tried to smuggle in God as if it were a fact? All the things that gave rise to science are ideas that humanity borrowed from God, which proves God is real, right? Wow. What? I have whiplash from watching that non sequitur go by so fast.
The founders of modern science assumed the intelligibility of nature, that nature had been designed by the mind of a rational.
The people who established the modern version of the scientific method that started to lay the groundwork of science as we know it today supposed that the world was understandable. This whole tacked on bit that it's rational because it was designed by an intelligent mind. Nope, that's bullshit that does not belong in that sentence.
God, the same God who made the rational minds of human beings. Thus, these men assumed that if they used their minds to carefully study nature, they could understand the order and design that God had placed in the world.
No, just that's laughably bad. They believed that if they used their minds, they could understand what order there is in a seemingly chaotic world. That whole, he's stapling ideas onto the end that don't belong there and don't actually have anything to do with the sentence. Like, take that God had placed in the world right off the end, and you're still saying the same thing.
Second, they assumed an underlying order in nature.
Yes and no. He's using very misleading wording there. First of all, a presupposition is not an assumption. Second of all, they didn't assume and just take it for granted. They presumed. They considered it a likely possibility, something that could be determined with testing, experimentation, and observation. Then when they did the experimentation and observation and testing, they discovered that they were, in fact, able to make heads or tails out of new concepts and ideas. Start to sort the wheat from the chaff intellectually, as it were. And many of these were tests of concepts laid down in the Bible. That's a trend that's carried on throughout history. And that's an interesting thing. As science advances, more and more of the gospel goes from being literal truth to metaphor or poetry. Isn't that peculiar?
This idea led to the unprecedented use of mathematics to describe the orderly processes at work in the world.
I once again refer you to the ancient Greeks, Archimedes and Pythagoras and so on, who laid the groundwork for virtually all advanced mathematics today. There was rather a lot of work on mathematics long before Christianity ever got close to the scene. With the possible exception of Newton's calculus, all the significant mathematics systems were already in existence before the scientific revolution began.
And it inspired the invention of better instruments, such as telescopes and microscopes, to see that order.
Hey, remember how Galileo got imprisoned because he pointed his telescopes that he made himself up into space and saw stuff moving? Can't have that. Nope. Learning things, very bad.
And third, these founders of modern science presupposed the contingency of nature. This simply means that God had many choices about how to make an orderly world.
Oh, he's trying to argue fine-tuning right from the dawn of the modern iteration of science.
Many ways to design a clock. There were many ways that God could have designed the universe. to discover how he did. Scientists could not merely deduce the order of nature by assuming what seemed most logical to them, that is, merely using reason alone to draw conclusions, as the Greek philosophers had tried to do. For example, the Greeks thought that since the most perfect form of motion was a circle, they assumed that the planets must have circular orbits, something that Kepler later refuted.
That's an example of the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. The philosophers were deductive, which is to say, you have an idea, and then you test it, you experiment on it with everything you can think of. But it's limited by what you can think of. There's a lot that humans, as creative as we can be, we cannot think of everything. Whereas when you do it the other way, when you see what the evidence is and then extrapolate your conclusion from that and test that conclusion against future observations, it takes the human limitation out of it. That's an important thing.
Careful observation. Indeed, because of their theological convictions, the new scientists realized that they would have to observe, test, and measure in order to understand God's design.
No, not because of their theological. If it had been based on their theological convictions, they wouldn't be observing or testing anything. If it were theological in nature, they would be, by requirement, opening up the Bible. We don't need to look at the sky. Let's read what the Scripture says, which is what people still do today, by the way.
These men, nature was like a book, a form of divine communication, intelligible to human investigation. For this reason, they also developed the concept of the laws of.
It's weird that he says that the laws of nature are like a book, because according to religion, the God did create a book. Why did the God not create another book with the laws of nature written in it? Or, perhaps even better, put the laws of nature in the book he did write. It's almost like he didn't write it.
Of nature, implying God's governance over the natural order. Science was a way to decipher that order. The idea that science and religion are in conflict is a popular belief today. But the history of science shows otherwise. All of us, laymen and scientists alike, owe a great debt to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Without that tradition...
Oh, for fuck's sake. This is some Frank Turek nonsense right here. Oh, you can't reason without stealing from Christianity to do it. Because, goodness knows, philosophers weren't using logic and reason long before Christianity was ever thought of. No. Reason only makes sense because we take that concept from God, from the religious tradition. So we have to accept religion in order to even use the concept of reason to argue against religion. It's circular, there's so many layers of fallacies, and it's exactly what he's saying right here. It's the same argument with extra steps, that you can't advance scientifically without borrowing from the religious tradition that expressly forbids the advancement of science. It's bloody ridiculous.
We'd be living in a much more primitive world, morally and scientifically.
Yeah, the Dark Ages. If the scientists hadn't bucked off the church and taken advantage of the schisms in the faith, we would still be in the Dark Ages, living in a much more primitive place, morally and scientifically. That's what churches produce. That's what religion produces. Now, look at the world around you. You're probably watching this on some technological device. You may have an electrical artificial light on nearby. You probably are in or near a building constructed with somewhat synthetic materials, or harvested metals, or quarried stone, or artificial stone, or there's so much around you. Can you see a car where you are? Can you see an airplane? Is there a street? Are there power lines? All of this world that we see around us is only due to the last few hundred years when science has been allowed to make even the most meager progress because the church lost its absolute authority. The fact you can hear me right now is due to science and in spite of, not because of, religion.
I'm Stephen Meyer, historian and philosopher of science at the Discovery Institute. Was the universe all...
Okay, so this is a 5-part series. That's cool. That's good to know. A final note from the last one. The Discovery Institute is a religious institution. It's a church first, science second. Let's continue with part 2.
always here? Or did it have a beginning? If so...
Okay, I'm going to place my bet. I am going to say that he's going to attempt to co-opt the Big Bang to try to prove Genesis was real. It's not like we've done this a few times before or anything.
So, how did it start? From ancient times, philosophers and theologians have debated these questions. But it wasn't until the 20th century that a series of stunning scientific discoveries finally enabled us to get some answers. The story begins...
Point of order. Even though it wasn't until the 20th century that scientific discoveries enabled us to get some answers, one must bear in mind, especially you, Mr. Historian, the entire time, religion had been asserting that it did have answers. And the answer they had was wrong.
Begins in 1912, when American astronomer Vesto Slipher observed that light coming from distant nebulae, clouds of dust and gas in outer space, appeared redder than expected. Why was this important? Here's where your high school science pays off. Remember learning about the Doppler effect? The frequency of sound, light, or other waves changes as the source and observer move toward or away from each other.
TLDR, Doppler effect is stuff moving towards you is shifted to a higher frequency, blue shifted. Stuff moving away from you is shifted to a lower frequency, red shifted. So, moving towards you, blue, away, red. That's the thing that he looked at. He saw some light was redder than he expected, therefore moving away.
This evidence of red shift suggested the nebulae were moving away from us. In 1924, astronomer Edwin Hubble, working with a new 100-inch telescope on Mount Wilson in California, showed that
when he says suggested, he means that's one possible explanation. Recession, the Doppler effect, is only one possible explanation for what could be red-shifting light.
In 1924, astronomer Edwin Hubble, working with a new 100-inch telescope on Mount Wilson in California, showed that Slipher's nebulae were not just clouds of gas around distant stars, but actually distant galaxies beyond our Milky Way. Soon after that...
And you can learn more about that discovery in my previous video about the Big Bang. It's fascinating stuff. In fact, I made a short about this too, because it's a fun fact. Our knowledge that there's more to the universe than just our own galaxy is from 1924. 99 years ago. We had no idea about the cosmos. We didn't know there were other galaxies or how vast the space around us is. It's just incomprehensible how much bigger our perception of the universe became literally overnight when Hubble discovered, when he announced that, the proof that Andromeda wasn't a nebula, but its own galaxy. There are other galaxies. Who knows how many there are? We still don't know how many there are. It's amazing. Truly awe-striking.
That the Belgian physicist Georges Lemaitre correlated Slipher's redshift data with Hubble's measurements of the distances to other galaxies. Lemaitre showed that galaxies that were farther away were receding faster than those close at hand.
That's partly true. Hubble actually did much of the measuring himself. He determined the redshift and the apparent distance and made the correlation that the redshift and the distance seemed to correlate as an apparent recessional velocity. And Truth Hubble himself never liked that answer. And he put a lot of work and research into finding alternative explanations. But while he found other things that were equally plausible, he was never able to rule out recessional velocity as a cause. And that's what Lemaitre ran with. He went, well, here we have this idea of recessional velocity, and we're about to see what he did with it.
It suggested a spherical expansion of the universe in all directions of space, as if the universe were expanding like a balloon from a singular explosive beginning.
Lemaitre, he wasn't just basing his work on the work of Hubble. He had also read Einstein's relativity. Lemaitre was aware of Einstein's calculation in general relativity that showed a finite universe could not exist in a static state. It had to be dynamic. It had to either expand or contract. Lemaitre said, what if it did collapse under the force of gravity, but we reverse the direction of time? We still don't have a good reason why, but we reverse the direction of time, and we have the collapse happen in reverse, and everything expands outward. That's where that comes from.
Einstein had earlier tumbled to this idea, but then dismissed it. Einstein's new theory of gravity, known as general relativity, envisioned massive bodies altering the curvature of space, like a bowling ball making a depression on a trampoline. Einstein's concept of gravity implied that space would contract in on itself unless gravity was continually counteracted by the expansion of space.
Einstein didn't propose the expansion of space as the counter. He proposed a cosmological constant, an unknown force to balance gravity. There may be some conflation on our host's part, because since the discovery of the Big Bang, Einstein dismissed the cosmological constant. And then when we discovered that the universe is still expanding and may even be accelerating, we reintroduced the cosmological constant, rebranded as dark energy, as the force driving the expansion of the universe. So it's the same mathematical symbol being used to represent dark energy and therefore expansion. But when Einstein used it, it was specifically not expansion. It was just an unknown counterforce to gravity.
And Einstein posited a constantly acting repulsive force, known as the cosmological constant, to counter gravitational attraction.
That's correct. He should have said that first and not thrown in that other bit about expansion, because Einstein did not propose that.
But that implied a dynamic and expanding universe.
I want to flip over a table. This dude, he keeps saying something factually wrong and then correcting it with the correct information and then ignoring his own correction and going back to being factually wrong. What is he doing? As I said, Einstein didn't believe. He showed mathematically that if the universe is finite, it must be dynamic. The implication of an expanding universe, he never bought that until Lemaitre showed him his proposal because it was absurd.
And also a beginning. To avoid this conclusion, Einstein altered his own equations by arbitrarily assigning a precise value to the force of expansion to ensure that the strength of gravity and the repulsive force exactly balanced.
It wasn't just that he just made it up. Yeah, Einstein was capable of making mistakes. He was capable of missing obvious answers. But that doesn't mean that those things mean what this dude asserts they mean, because they certainly do not.
Thus he depicted the universe in a perfectly poised static state, neither expanding from a beginning nor contracting toward a collapse. But then with Slipher and Hubble's discoveries, the heavens talked back. In 1927, Lemaitre informed Einstein, in a taxicab no less, about the redshift evidence for an expanding universe. In 1931, Einstein visited Hubble.
I'm not familiar with that taxicab story. I may look that up. It sounds apocryphal.
At the Mount Wilson Observatory and viewed the evidence for himself. Later, he announced, to his great credit, that denying the evidence for the universe having had a beginning was the greatest blunder of
This is a famous quote. You know what? I'll let him
my
finish it.
scientific career.
That's not what he said. That is... He said the addition of the cosmological constant to his equation was the greatest blunder of his career. It pisses me off because they changed his wording in the most misleading way possible. He was not denying the universe had a beginning. He said only that the addition of the cosmological constant was a blunder.
Throughout the 20th century, physicists proposed other theories that denied a cosmic beginning.
Theologically motivated scientists used motivated reasoning to construct alternative explanations that denied a cosmic beginning.
New evidence showed each to be inadequate. By the 1990s, the Big Bang theory had prevailed as the best explanation for multiple lines of astronomical evidence.
So again, I'll refer you back to my other video about the Big Bang that explains how we know what we know. But to sum up, the reason he says the 1990s is that we finally got a satellite up, the Cosmic Microwave Background Explorer, in order to really thoroughly measure the cosmic microwave background and show that it matched the predictions for what the first light of the universe. Well, it's called the last scattering, but that's a long story. The first light of the early universe was. And that was the thing that pretty much sealed the fate of every other possible hypothesis. Now I say pretty much, because a few did hang on until 2008, but that's another story entirely.
So why was such evidence upsetting to Einstein and to many other scientists? Princeton University physicist Robert Dickey explained, "An infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past."
Not exactly, because you wouldn't have to explain it in any particular finite time, but you would still have to explain where the matter came from and where it continues to come from.
And so it would. But if the physical universe of matter, energy, space, and time had a beginning, it becomes extremely difficult to conceive of a physical or material cause for the origin of the universe.
That sounds like a you problem, homie. I mean, just because you find it difficult to conceive of a physical or material cause doesn't mean there isn't one.
After all, it was matter and energy that first came into existence at the Big Bang. Before
Most models do not make that assumption. Most of them have the matter and energy already existing when the Big Bang happened and set them free.
that, no matter or energy would have yet existed to do the causing.
And that's why many models don't say that. That's his supposition. It supports his idea that there's no matter or energy there to do the causing. In fact, it's an assumption to say that there even was a cause. Without time running, the concept of cause doesn't even make sense.
Consequently, whatever did cause the universe to exist would need to be immaterial and exist beyond space and time.
Non sequiturs. Again, we don't need to have a cause. And the idea of a cause is a logical impossibility. You have to provide some evidence of how something without matter or energy could cause anything to happen. If you have neither matter nor energy, how can you do anything? And so just on that point of immaterial alone, you've created another logical impossibility. Never mind that it's outside of time, where the very concept of cause and effect doesn't even apply. How can it manipulate things? How can it cause anything at all to be?
To many scientists and philosophers, all this sounds an awful lot like the first words of the Bible. In the beginning,
Here it is. Genesis, yes.
God created the heavens and the earth. I'm Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, and author of Return of the God Hypothesis.
Okay, and that's the end of part 2. I think this would be a good point to put a little divider, make this part 1 of this video, and then we'll continue with PragerU in part 2. If you have a suggestion for a title so we don't end up calling them part 1 and part 2, I would love to hear it. Please drop it in the comments. In any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't done it already, please do. It helps growth a lot. Also consider hitting that like button, leaving comments, sharing, whatever. Anything you can do helps the algorithm notice me, senpai, and grow this channel, which lets us make better, bigger videos in the future. So thank you for everything you do. I appreciate it very much. And as always, question everything, stay curious, because you are better than religion.